like sorcery, magic, mysticism, whatever you want to like. How based on what you've learned, and maybe this isn't your expertise, but I would love to hear if you have any thoughts on it. Like, how high does the pyramid go, and who do you think's at the top of it?
Well, this is interesting because you have to go on an esoteric level with that. Because if you were looking at it just from a geopolitical level, that's why people come up with all these various things and say, the Jesuits, the Masons, the Jews, whatever it would happen to be. None of that ever works. It all becomes very stylized for one group to go after another group. No, if you really go into it, it's very interesting. Ezekiel in the Bible, there's a lot in Ezekiel, I would say, that gives you a hint that something extra is going on. And people always, go back to this wheel within a wheel, and they're like, oh, he's looking at an alien visitation or something, like an ancient aliens trip. But I gone very deeply into the Edgar Casey readings, and Casey gave 900 readings on Atlantis. And the guy was incredibly accurate on a mystical level. He could diagnose you sitting there and give you a whole thing about your ailments and how to, basically get back to a healthy state just by knowing your address. So, and Casey had 5 decades of documentation of doing this. When he got into giving readings about Atlantis, it's very interesting because somebody asked him, well, you're talking about Atlantean craft flying around advanced 10,000, 20,000 years ago. Like, can you give us some example? Like, what did it look like? And he said, well, it's very much like Ezekiel's example, except that was much later. So this is very interesting because he's talking about this earlier civilization having advanced technology, and then Ezekiel talking about it maybe around 1000 BC. But who kept the technology in between the time when this great civilization was destroyed? So Casey gives us a lot of indications, and it's edgy. Actually, the foundation that promotes his work, the ARE, they don't know what to do with that because it's very edgy stuff. When they asked Casey, well, what did the Atlanteans do? Well, they controlled flight with their minds. They used their minds to do it, and they say, well, would they fly over mountains? How high was the altitude? He said, oh yeah, they would fly over mountains. They would fly through mountains. Dematerialization. So they had all kinds of advanced technologies back then. It's an older technology. So when you're getting into Egypt and the Mayas and all that, their legacy cultures from that advanced thing back there. So the whole thing about flight and our fascination with it, et cetera, is when we got into the 20th century, what Casey said is that no, these aren't discoveries, actually. These are memories. So the people who are reincarnating are remembering the technology and plugging it back in.
Whoa,
Yeah.
whoa.
So the only problem is last time they basically blew it up, right? So this is the same group of Atlanteans. They come back in, they have the memory, they create the super sophisticated technology. By the way, I mean, in a very short period of time, we're talking about like 100 years here, where we've gone from horse and buggy to space flight. So, we're on the advanced plan at this point. But I think if you go, when you talk about the hierarchy and stuff, if you go back to Atlantis, when you get people like Casey bringing that information out, the Steiner work, there's a whole mystery school edge around Atlantis and their advanced technology way before you get to us.
And
So
it's
that's where I think
just,
it opens up.
yeah, I find it so interesting. And like, we've had people come out and say, they believe that Atlantis, a lot of people from Atlantis went to Ireland.
Yeah.
There's a big thought. The reason some of that makes sense to me is because, and this is Sam speaking, is like, if you, I like, I'm part Moor. Like when you go back far enough,
Oh,
I have
yeah.
more, I have more in me. My grandmother was Sicilian, and you study like, lost civilizations, hidden history of Florida. The Moors were most likely there. This, a lot of the stories we're told in our public schools aren't real. And then you kind of look at like the culture that's pushed on those people and how it's kind of like crazy, like wild, like drinking, partying, nuts. And it's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
are they dumbing down this very powerful group of people with low
Interesting.
vibrational stuff so they
Yeah.
can never realize how super powerful they are because they were great conquerors, great navigators, great explorers, and stuff like that. And like the history of Europe and what Europe is, the the Bach saga, what is interesting, and all that. Like,
Oh yeah.
how old do you think our world is?
Oh, it's a lot. It's a lot older. This whole thing, the way that we have civilization, 6,000 BC coming into being, it's absurd. And I think enough researchers have proven that, but I don't think they go far enough mystically. This is the interesting thing. And we had Graham Hancock up here. I did an event with him, and he's done great research around how the Egyptians were in a legacy culture from something older. And a lot of those guys put the date of the destruction at 10,500 BC. It's interesting because that's Casey's date about when Atlantis went down, and they all went in different directions. Some of them went to the Mayans, some of them became the Incas, some of them became the Egyptians. But Casey does have a thing in there which is different, I think, from everyone else. He said that there's a hall of records under the Sphinx that the Atlanteans kept, and that is going to open up the whole question around the origins of civilization, and that we haven't discovered that. And when they asked him, for details, he said, "Well, the Atlanteans placed it there. It's like basically like the world's oldest time capsule."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh
and
shit.
and it's weird because he places the whole dates of the pyramid at 10,500 BC. But if you go into his readings deeply, he'll say, yeah, when the Atlanteans were doing that, they were doing archaeology to find the best spot. So there was already a culture at Giza before 10,500 BC. So traditionally, the pyramids are 2,500 BC, the Sphinx is 2,500 BC. Casey moves it back to 10,500 BC, but he's saying they're placing that whole thing on a plateau that's actually much older. So they want to place their records in the pyramids there in the right spot because it was the right spot a long time before them. So you're going back a long time, maybe
Before even
200,000.
Atlantis, there was a civilization.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. I know. So they're doing
Wow.
archaeology, right? So this is the nature of it. And I think the technology thing comes up in Casey's work. It does connect the psychic side. And I don't think you can leave out um, the kind of mystery school edge when it comes to things like advanced technology. Because, especially in Casey's work, he talks about the two eye stone. And a long story short, on the two eye stone, it's Tuaoi. It's a weird word. He uses it over and over again, talking about the Atlanteans, but it's a gigantic power grid in that era during Atlantis. And we did a whole documentary on it called Hacking Atlantis, which is all about tracking that two eye stone grid. And he said at a certain point, it did the reverse. It pulled everything down. And so when you go into areas like the Bermuda Triangle, that whole thing, that's the technology operating backwards, creating vortexes and things of this nature. And he said, if you want to find them, if you want to find the ruins of that civilization, you look off the coast of Bimini, it's already rising. So there's a whole thing there, I think, in the Casey readings about that technological grid, what they used, a gigantic power crystal grid. And so this is the rediscovery, I think, for us of that ancient technology. And so that is a whole hacking Atlantis thing because, people talk about it and it's like, do you want to find an Atlantis that just had like pottery and stuff? No, the whole point is you hear things about something weird going on back there, an explosion. Plato said it went down in one day. How do you do that? That's like a nuclear event.
Yeah,
So,
that's
yeah.
something hit big
Yes.
and just hit reset.
Yes.
And the world came back completely different.
Yes.
And oh,
Echoes. There were echoes, legends. Uh, so by the time you get to Plato, he's writing about it and he's saying, well, it's actually a relative of mine got the story from an Egyptian priest who said, oh, yeah, 9,500 years ago, you guys fought off the Atlanteans. They were coming in and their whole island had gone down, you know, and he places it right outside of the Straits of Gibraltar. So that's the Atlantic Ocean. I know people do this thing now with Atlantis. They put it all over the place, but
yeah.
the literature has it on one side, the Mediterranean, on the other side, the Gulf of Mexico. There's no getting around that. And it's not Antarctica, it's not in India or whatever. Atlantis was right in the Atlantic, and Casey said the opening for that was in Bimini, and that it would rise, and that we would be able to see it. And you do have the Bimini Road and things down there. So what the nice part of that is we can get access to it, unlike Antarctica.
Or like the library at the Vatican. Like what kind of
Yeah.
like knowledge is in there that you would
Yeah.
just be like, oh, this unlocks everything and the world's a different place.
Exactly. You've got it. They have it already. And whenever a major discovery happens, they check in with them first because they have it in the library. It's an interesting story, actually, just to round out the whole Atlantis thing. There was a researcher, a woman, Paulina Zalitsky, who was originally from Ukraine and under the USSR and stuff. And they sent her to Cuba to do some underwater investigations, and she defected to Canada. And then later, Castro hired her, and he said, "Oh, I want to find, Spanish galleons off the coast." And this Zalitsky woman, she, with her oceanographer team, went off the western tip of Cuba and found, she said, an entire metropolis, a whole city. And she said, as soon as she found it, the Cuban Navy booted her out of there. They put her in a Mexican prison for 10 days to scare her. So she went back to Canada. And but she found this incredible thing, and she, in her book, where she makes these references now in this book, she won't talk about the actual event, but she makes these references in the book that Castro and the Pope got together in 1998 to certify that these were Atlantean ruins. And Castro did, in fact, he went down to Cuba. Castro was there, and the Pope came down to Cuba to visit. It was the first papal visit to Cuba. And he's down there, and everyone wonders, why did the Pope do this now? Well, it's because Castro wanted to check in and say, are these ruins the same thing you have in your Vatican library? So, behind the scenes, they know, so they're so far ahead.
So much. They know
Yeah.
so much. They won't let us know. And I don't know what the purpose of that is.